In this video, we're calling the classic era just any cards released before synchros. And in this, we're going to look at some of the worst equipped spells of these older cards. Starting us off at number 10, we have Scroll of Bewitchment. This is an equipped spell that asks you to declare an attribute upon activation, and then equip monster becomes that attribute. This card just does too little on its own to ever be worth running. There are no innate benefits to being a specific attribute in Yu-Gi-Oh! So what this card does is be entirely reliant on other cards on the field. For example, if you've got your opponent floodgated under Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, you can use the scroll as a way to negate monster effects. The thing is that most of these interactions are just not worthwhile if you need to also have a generally useless card like the scroll for them to work. Let's say your opponent is locked under Gozen Match, which restricts players to having a single attribute on the field. You can equip the scroll to one of their guys and declare another one to use it as a removal spell, since it'll force them to send it to the graveyard. While that's a non-destruction removal, it's still way clunkier than just using some targeted removal like Soul Taker. If you're looking at more modern options, there are cards like Layer of Darkness and Stealth Kraken that change all the monsters of the field to an attribute instead, making their synergy with Gozen Match way better than this card's. The other use for Scroll is enabling you to use attribute support on your cards you usually would not be able to, like Calling Light and suddenly being able to use Honest on anything, or Earth and then having an easier time making an Echeria Beast. Neither of these are bad cards per se, but if they require to have a specific equip to make use of them, they would be, making Scroll Bewitchment not worth considering ever. And at number 9, we've got Armed Changer. This card must be activated by sending another equipped spell from your hand to the graveyard. While it's equipped to a monster, if it destroys something by battle, that monster's controller can add a monster with an attack equal to or less than the equipped ones from the graveyard back to hand. The inherent problem with equips, and the reason why they're the weakest kind of spells overall, is the potential to get 2 for 1 if your opponent removes the monster it was equipped to. It doesn't matter how many equips your monster has, if the monster gets outed, the equips all go with him. Arm Changer makes that even worse with its heavy cost of pitching another equipped spell from your hand, handing a 3 for 1 straight on the platter for your opponent. As if that wasn't bad enough, the payoff is just no good. It doesn't boost the monster's stats or give it any sort of protection, so you'll need a decently statted guy out to make use of it in the first place. And even if you do assemble all of that and manage to beat over something by battle, what you get isn't worth the effort. Recycling monsters from the graveyard is pretty strong, especially back then when your options were pretty limited, but this card just doesn't do its job well. Most monsters could be recycled more easily via revival spells like Call of the Haunted or Premature Burial. The ones that couldn't usually had such high stats you'd have a hard time ever getting them back with Arm Changer anyway. Then if you advance just a little bit further in time, there's no reason why you'd ever want to run it over Monster Reincarnation, which is only usable once, yeah, but it's guaranteed to get whatever monster you want back, unlike this terrible card. And at number 8, there's Vicious Claw. This spell gives the equipped monster 300 attack, and if it would be destroyed by battle, you return Vicious Claw to your hand instead, and then destroy a monster in the field except the one that battled the equipped monster, and your opponent takes 600 damage. After that resolves, you special summon a 2500 attack and defense evil token to your opponent's side of the field. During the turn this card is returned to your hand, you can't use it again for the turn. This card has a string of effects so confusing and seemingly disconnected, you'd think it was AI generated, if not for being printed all the way back in 2008. If you wanted either an attack boost or battle protection, there are many other equips which could give you so without having to jump through so many hoops. So you equip this to a monster, and then can sit on it without worrying about it being beaten over, right? Well, not really. Imagine you have a monster equipped with this and then your opponent goes and tries to destroy it by battle. Even if Vicious Claw prevents that battle destruction, this second part of its effect will trigger and force you to destroy a monster on the field except the attacking one. So if your opponent only has a single monster, you'll be forced to pop one of yours. If both of you only have a single monster on field, that could very well mean you protected yours from being destroyed by battle, only to be forced to destroy it with Vicious Claw's effect. Then, if all that wasn't enough, it still will give your opponent a huge token for their trouble. In the end, this card's random tacked on 600 burn might be its most beneficial effect overall. The only good thing we can say about Vicious Claw is that it's one of the few anime cards whose effect was kept intact when being brought over to the TCG, for better or for worse. And at number 7, we've got Amplifier. This card can only be equipped to Jinzo and changes its effect to only negate the trap cards of your opponent, and also has some old school spell speed for protection, where its activation and effect cannot be negated. Now, while Jinzo did see a ton of competitive play back in the day, and even occasionally sees play today, as its stats are premium for its 1 tribute cost and total negation of a third of the cards in the game, its specific equip card was usually not played alongside it. And that's because, while being able to use your traps while Jinzo was out was good, it wasn't enough. Because Jinzo being out and negating your opponent's traps back in the day was usually a death sentence already, so you didn't even need to use your traps to close out a win. The most common types of traps were monster removal, so Jinzo was perfectly safe as is. and could easily swing over most non-tribute summoned monsters. Plus, even if you were playing a ton of traps, you probably wouldn't be playing Jinzo in your deck, because you couldn't rely on drawing into Amplifier to be able to use your traps. In Duel Links, they had a skill which increased the attack of Jinzo by 500 points when it was equipped with Amplifier, and it still wasn't used. And in Duel Links, the deck size limit is 20, so it's much easier to dig for the card you want. But simply being able to also use your traps and having a 500 attack boost was just not enough, even in the slow format of Duel Links when skill and Jinzo were added. The only use for Amplifier is in funny infinite combo decks, like if there was a skill drain and Royal Decree out and Jinzo kept turning them on and off. And at number 6, we have Demotion, an equip that lowers the equipped monster's level by 2. This card's effect is just too minor to do anything, and the situation it's useful in are so specific it might as well make Scroll of Bewitchment look like a staple. The funniest thing about Demotion is that it came out way back in 2003 when there was pretty much no cards that cared about a monster's level on the field. With its latest printing being in 2005, it still kept its pre-problem solving card tax effect, which says it downgrades the monster. So the first uses that come to mind for this card would be using it to set up your own synchro plays with it, except that would never be worth it. Level modulation is an effect that's never worth an entire card for. In most instances, it would just be added as a benefit to an already good effect. Even so, back then, most of the commonly used tuners were levels 2 or 3, and there was just less value in the level 1s. With the most common level being 4, a level 1 tuner would enable you to go into Cataster, a magical android, who are by no means bad, but the 6s and 7s were more powerful monsters most of the time. And if you look at this card in the opposite direction, as a way to disrupt your opponent's plays, it's more akin to a very minor speed bump. If they're on a synchro strategy, odds are their tuners aren't going to be sticking on the field. And if they are, it's because they've got some other effect that makes them good. The first archetype to really care about its own levels, Fortune Ladies, was never really such a threat to need specific hate like this. Even in Duel Links where they were actually meta, you'd be better off just playing anything else too. While later on we'd get more archetypes that care about their levels like FAs or Cleaforts, there was still no reason to have downgrade over actual removal. And even if you really wanted to go after your opponent's levels just for the sake of it, you'd be better off with Stygian Dirge and Mischief of the Good Gnomes, messing with them permanently instead. By slotting this card in, the only thing getting downgraded is your own deck. And at number 5, we have Laser Cannon Armor. This card increases the attack and defense of an insect monster equipped with it by 300 points. By all metrics, this is the worst stat boost equip in the whole game. For a first bit of context, we have to consider this card came out in the first main set to be released, Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon, in 2002. Even then, it'd go on to get power crept only a few months later in Metal Raiders, the very next set, as we got Sword of Deep-Seated, a 500 boost, and for any type of monster too. But even before that came out, this card already floundered compared to its competition. LOB actually had a full series of typal equip spells, and even if none of them were ever more than playground playable, the insect one is especially bad. If you look at the card pool of the oldest Yu-Gi-Oh format people play, Yugi Kaiba format, which includes the aforementioned Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon and starter decks for Kaiba and Yugi, there's just nothing you'd ever want to equip a laser cannon armor on. Even though Maneater Bug is a playable card in there, it's not a monster you'd ever be playing to beat over stuff. Your other options are Basic Insect and Como Otoko, vanillas with 500 and 700 attack respectively. Even though the Thunder and Plant equips are also quite pointless, they at least have some slightly less worse beaters that put the insects to shame. Even then, for all of these, you'd be better off running Invigoration since they're all Earth attribute, making these cards even more pointless. With its tiny card pool, Yugi Kaiba format pretty much only had Fiend, Spellcasters, Rocks, and Beast Warriors as playable types, with Fiend being by far the best of them due to having Legend, Summon Skull, and Wall of Illusions. And even so, the Fiend equip Dark Energy was still never even considered as a real option. There was just never any hope for laser cannon armor, if even with all of the added context of the confines of a tiny format with only 185 cards. It's still one of the worst ones in there. And at number 4, we have the legendary Black Belt. This card can only be equipped to Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, Monk Fighter, and Master Monk. It makes it so that when the equipped monster destroys something by battle and sends it to the graveyard, your opponent takes damage equal to that monster's defense. The monster who had the honor to be directly named by this card are respectively a 1200 attack vanilla, a 1300 beater that might as well be a vanilla, and a 1900 attack double attacker that can only be summoned by tributing the previous one. This card's effect would already probably be bad enough for it to make it onto this list, but it being limited to such a bad roster of monsters only drags it further down. What's even more disappointing is that there are even more cards which support the troop of bad monsters, and this is the worst of them. Caminite Blow and Lone Wolf are not cards you'd ever want to run either, but they still put legendary black belt to shame. Either way, the odds of either Chusuke or Monk Fighter beating over something that matters is extremely low unless they're equipped with a bunch of other equipped spells. And even if they do manage to, you're not going to get meaningful burn damage out of it. While Master Monk is at least a 1900 beater, it's pretty tough to bring out, specifically requiring you to tribute Monk Fighter beforehand. Its effect does give it 2 attacks, potentially letting you get double the payoff from Black Belt, but that's still not enough. You're ways off from matching any of the other tributes or chaos monsters of the era, and even if you're looking from it at a less meta angle, even the 2k defenders will stop you in your tracks. Leave it to this card to require a 3-card combo to be of any use and still lose to monsters from the first set of the game. And at number 3, we have Germ Infection. This spell decreases the attack of a non-machine type monster equipped with it by 300 during each of its standby phases. This is as close as you'll get to an equipped spell that does literally nothing. Not only is a 300 debuff pretty minor, it makes you wait a whole turn for it to even apply once. Even if this card's lack of problem-solving card text might make it unclear, it only decreases the monster's attack during each of your standby phases. So you can equip it, pass turn, and your opponent will still have their beater intact on their turn. You can't even shake it off as just a byproduct of this time, as even the other pack filler quotes from the same set are better. Paralyzing Potion stops an equipped non-machine monster from attacking, which is probably what you want when using Germ Infection anyway. The further you go, the more this card gets outshone by other throwaway commons no one ever wanted to pull. Shooting Star Bowl Seal can drop an opponent's attack by 1000 straight up, and Dark World Shackles turns any monster's stats into almost 0. And these still have the same problem, which is that they are generally just worse than any removal spell you could ever get your hands on. Your opponent still keeps that body, which they can use as a resource to keep it around for its other effects. Even back then, you had the option to just tribute it off, and then later on you could use it for synchros, XCs, and etc, etc. The only way for Germ Infection to ever impact a game is if you're discarding it for the cost of another card. And at number 2, we have Trial of the Princess. This card can only be equipped to with either White Magician Pikaru or Ebon Magician Kuren, and gives the monster 800 attack. During a turn in which the equipped monster beats over a level 5 or higher monster by battle, you contribute it in this equipped card to special summon either Princess Pikaru or Kuren from your hand or deck, depending on which was the equipped monster. The base form of Pikaru is a light spellcaster with 200 attack that during the standby phase gives you 400 life points for each monster you control. And Kuren has the same stats and is a dark attribute and deals 300 damage to your opponent for each monster they control. These are 2 pretty lame monsters to have an equip spell for just themselves. Their effects are negligible and actually kind of hard to pull off, since they need to survive a whole turn and see your next standby phase with their paltry stats. They're also both heavily outclassed by a ton of other monsters in their same niche, even if you're just looking at more old and low rarity stuff. Dancing Fairy and Stealth Bird are much better stat-wise and can heal or burn for a flat 1000 each, and even those aren't what you'd call power cards either. The Trial of the Princess is clearly meant to make up for these weaknesses somehow, but it just doesn't. An 800 attack boost does turn them into 2k beaters, but that just means you need 2 cards to do what a vanilla can do in 1. The condition this equip has to rank the girls up is also so hard to pull off it might as well not even be there. There are very few playable level 5 or higher monsters that have sub 2000 stats, with the only one that comes to mind being Air Knight Parshath, who stopped seeing play around the same time this card came out. So you'll probably need a 3rd card to help you win a battle on top of all that, or Nightmare Archfiends to give your opponent a high level monster. And for all that effort, you deserve a payoff that just reads, you win the duel. But the princesses, of course, are much less than that. The evolved forms of Pikaru and Kuren just have the 800 attack boost integrated into their baseline stats, and doubles the values for their effects. The only positive thing we can say about the Trial of the Princess is that at least it's not as bad as the next card on this list. And finally, at number 1, we have Magical Labyrinth. It can only be equipped to Labyrinth Wall and lets you tribute it to summon Wall Shadow from your deck. Labyrinth Wall is a level 5 Earth Rock vanilla monster with 0 attack and 3000 defense, and its Shadow is a level 7 Dark Warrior monster with 1600 attack and 3000 defense that can't be normaled and must only be special summoned through this card. What better way to close out the list than equip which actually has no reason to be one? Magical Labyrinth exists only as a way to turn your wall from a defender into a very mediocre beater, and it doesn't even pretend to have any other use. At least in the previous slot, the Trial of the Princess would at least slightly buff the monster's attack to justify being an equip spell. This does nothing of the sort, and nor does it have a special condition that must happen for its effect to apply, making it puzzling as to why they just make it a spell that tributes Labyrinth Wall to bring out Wall Shadow. All this ends up doing is making this combination vulnerable to both monsters and spell trap removal all at once. Not that there's much of a reason to interact with this combo anyway. As bad as Kuren or Chusuke are without their respective equips, they could at least beat over stuff and do something to progress the game state. Labyrinth Wall just sits there doing nothing, and you can't even summon it for free due to its high level. Wall Shadow, being so terrible, only serves to rub more salt into the wound. The first starter decks give you monsters that are just as good as attacking as Wall Shadow without having to jump through any hoops to bring them out. Sure, Wall Shadow has way more defense, but if your main goal is just to use it to turtle up, why even bother with its equip in the first place? In the anime, the card was a fusion of Labyrinth and Shadow Ghoul, but they couldn't even be bothered to give it Ghoul's effect while also making it harder to summon than if it was a purple card still. Out of all of the failures of them trying to translate cool moments from the show into the actual TCG, this might just be the most embarrassing of them all. Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other cards I may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.